My name is Dalton L. Townsend, and I'm in Knoxville, Tennessee. Today is July 24, 2007, and I am going to be interviewing Justice E. Riley Anderson of Knoxville. This interview is taking place as a part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation and the Supreme Court Historical Society. Would you give us your full name and address and date of birth?
My name is Edward Riley Anderson. My date of birth is August 10th, 1932, and I live at 2233 Breakwater Drive, Knoxville, Tennessee.
Justice Anderson, you and I have known each other, 35 years or so.
Longer than we both want to say, probably.
And I'm going to refer to you as Justice in this interview, but if I slip up and call you Riley, forgive me. But,
well, I'll answer to anything.
Okay. Tell us, I'm going to take you through your early life and your upbringing, school, before we get to your law practice and then your career as an appellate judge. Tell us where you were born.
I was born in Chattanooga, Tennessee.
And tell us about your parents.
Well, my mother was married, and we went to Chattanooga, Tennessee. My biological father was a University of Tennessee engineering student. And they were there for a fairly short time. I don't know just how long, but I was born there. My father died after about 6 months in an automobile accident. And at the same time, this was 1932 in the Depression, the Holston Valley Bank failed. My mother had all of her resources in that bank, and so she returned to Knoxville needing employment. And I, of course, came back with her. And I had an older brother who was a year and a half older, Joe. And so she brought the two of us back here. And I guess she stayed with relatives, I don't know. But she got a job at Eastern State Hospital. And that job did not have any provision for children. You got your room, a single room, and you got board there, and she was working as a ward attendant. You worked 12 hours a day, and you worked 7 days a week, and you got Sunday afternoons off, but not every Sunday. So we were kept by a friend of hers named Money Hayes, and she lived in the university area on Laurel Avenue.
Let me interrupt you just a moment. What was your mother's name?
Catherine Tillery Anderson.
And your father's name?
His name was Edward Everett.
Okay. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
That's all right. And so we lived with Money Hayes. I don't know how she got that. I suppose she gave us money at some time or another, how she got the nickname. But in any case, we lived with her for 4 years, and she began to take in other foster children as well. So there were at times maybe 10 or 12 children there in that environment. And Mother visited us on Sundays and took us down to the hospital on Sundays as she could. And then after a 4-year period, she remarried Carl Lester Anderson, who was my stepfather and who adopted us, my brother and I. And she, for a couple of years, or 3 years, established a foster home herself so that they could have she took in children and she could have a home where we could live. And that was in the university area on Highland Avenue and on Forest Avenue. And I went to Van Gilder School in the University of Tennessee area. And then we moved down to Eastern State. Housing was provided for us there. There were about 6 houses on Eastern State property. 4 of them were doctors. And this is Eastern State Hospital, which was a mental hospital. located on Linesview Pike in Knoxville. And we got what was called the farmhouse. It was the worst of the 6 houses. And that was before Fort Loudon Dam was built.
Now, what year was this that you moved back?
This was
there?
it would be about 1938.
And you would have been about 6 years old.
6 years
Okay.
old, maybe 39, because I went to Van Gilder for a year.
Right.
And so the dam was built, and the creek in our backyard all of a sudden became a lake. And so our undesirable house all of a sudden became very desirable. But we kept it for all the years that we were there. And we were there up until about 1946.
Okay.
And my stepfather went to join his brother in a propane butane gas business, and we moved to West Knoxville on Gleason Road.
You say the property became desirable because of the lake being developed. Did you enjoy the water?
Oh yes, we had a boat, and interestingly enough, the patients at the hospital, some of them were very talented and creative. They built wooden boats, sailboats, and we had access to those. And so it really was a interesting experience, and ever since that living on the lake at that time, I've tried to be on the water somewhere.
Still have a boat?
I still have a boat, yeah.
All right, we're up to when I think you moved to Gleason Road.
Yes.
Is that right?
Mhm.
Which is kind of the West Town area, for
Right.
those who might not know.
Yeah.
Behind West Town
Yeah.
Mall, as it
Mhm.
now is. Tell us about your life during that period.
Okay. Prior to that time, I went to Bearden School, Bearden Elementary School. Bearden was a grade 1 through 12 school. And as you and I mentioned, Bob Campbell was a student there when I was there. And then I shifted to Farragut when we went out to Gleason Road. At that time, there wasn't any bus service or anything of that sort. If you wanted to go out that far, you bought a local ticket on a Greyhound bus, 25 cents. Went to Nashville, and it let you off at Gleason. And you walked about a mile to where our house was.
Farragut was way out there.
Farragut was a long way out, sure was.
And how far did you actually live from Farragut?
We lived a long way because Gleason, we were right at Galahar View Road there.
Right.
So it was a long way to Farragut. And actually it was reasonably close to the Bearden. It's close to that line where they divided the schools.
And how long did you go to Farragut?
I went there for about 3 years. Finished elementary school there and went to the first year of high school there. And it was, again, a grade 1 through 12 school. Agriculture was a required course. I was there during the war, and they actually had victory gardens where the students worked in the garden. And I don't know what they did with the produce, but
Even when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, Farragut was like a different place.
oh yes.
There was nothing between West Knoxville and Farragut except farmland, if I recall.
Yeah.
Things have changed. So you finished your freshman year at Farragut
At Farragut.
High School. And during this time frame, were you working to help support yourself and your family?
Yes, I did. We had, of course, had paper routes when we were. That was the first job that I remember that we had at a very young age. And
What paper did you service?
it was the News Sentinel.
Okay.
And then we were journal carriers too, because we carried in the morning. Got up about 5 o'clock in the morning and carried the journal. Both my brother and I. And I think I may have mentioned to you in the past that I was a switchboard operator at Eastern State Hospital when I was 12 years old. My first real job, and I was terminated from that job because I couldn't stay awake.
What was your rate of pay?
I've forgotten. It wasn't much. But I was a relief operator on the weekends, on Saturdays and Sundays. And primarily what you served as was a security device for each of the wards. There were 12 wards on which patients were located, and the people who were supervising that ward would call in every hour. And so at 3 o'clock in the morning, all the lights would light up on the switchboard. And I would answer, and they were okay. But some of the times I didn't answer. So that was, I did that for about 6 months. And I worked in a grocery store, Dalton store at the end of Linesview Pike, just outside the hospital. And then I did farm work.
While your mother was with Eastern State, did you interact with the patients very much?
Yes, I did. There were a number of patients that were so-called trustees who were, who were out in the community, weren't in the wards, and medicated, and couldn't tell any difference from them and anybody else. And some of them would realize when they were going to have a bad spell, and they would ask to go back in. So yeah, I had a lot of interaction with patients there.
If I recall, during that time, or at least later, Eastern State was a full-service psychiatric hospital.
There were 2,500 patients there during that period of time. There were 2 physicians and the superintendent. And my mother, who started as a ward attendant, ended up being in charge of their new treatment facility, and recreation and rehabilitation before she left there.
Now, for those who don't know, was this run by the state or another entity?
It was run by the state.
Okay. I can recall seeing padded cells there
Yeah.
when I was a youngster and visited it there. Okay, when did your mother leave?
She left the hospital in the late 1940s when we were close to going to college, and she took her retirement and began the nursing home business.
Okay.
And my brother, fortunately, got an appointment to Annapolis, and so there wasn't a lot of expense to help him go to Annapolis, but she was anticipating that she was going to need more funds.
Okay. You, after the first year at Farragut, where did you complete your high school education?
I went to Central High School.
Did you and your mother move?
We moved out on Broadway. She had started with a residential nursing home out there with about 20 patients.
What was the name of that nursing home?
Anderson Nursing Home.
Okay. Where was it on Broadway?
It was in the Arlington area.
Near Fairmont?
Yeah.
Right.
Past Fairmont towards Fountain City.
Right.
Then
and
she ultimately built a 100-bed nursing home on Broadway in that area, and began a chain of nursing homes with some partners.
Okay, we'll come back to that in a moment.
Okay.
So you completed your 3 years at Central High School.
Right.
What do you recall about those 3 years?
Oh, it was interesting. A different kind of school. Fountain City was a fairly integrated place in terms of people, generation, after generation having lived there. I think it started in maybe the 20s and up to the 50s, so it was a settled place. But the other thing about it was that it was a good athletic school. It was also a good academic school, and we were going there from West Knoxville. We traveled from West Knoxville to there because my mother thought it was the best academic school in the county. And you didn't have zoning then, so you could go anywhere in the county you wanted. So that's how we ended up at Central.
That was quite a long distance to go.
It was. You could catch the streetcar or the bus down on Lions View Pike, come into Midtown, transfer, and go to Fountain City.
What were some of your activities and likes in while you were at Central?
I played basketball there up until that time. I hadn't been active in any sports. We pretty much worked after we got through the school on the farm, and so we had sort of a truck farm, and we weren't allowed to participate in athletics. So, but when we got to Central, I played basketball there. My brother played football.
Had some great football teams, if I recall. You graduated in what year?
1950.
Was your mother well into the nursing home business at that time?
She was just beginning it, really, maybe her first year or so.
Okay. And did you go straight into college?
I went straight to college.
Ever consider going anywhere other than the University of Tennessee?
Well, I didn't for economic reasons. I really, until I got to graduate school, I didn't think about other schools other than the University of Tennessee. But economics prevented us from considering anything other than living at home and going to UT.
You mentioned your brother was accepted and attended Annapolis,
Right.
the Naval Academy. While we're talking about him, did he graduate from the Naval Academy?
Yes, he did.
And did he have a career in the
He had a
Navy?
career in the Navy. He was in nuclear submarines, had command of a submarine.
Which submarines did he command?
The USS Conger was one of them. It was not a nuclear submarine. Can't really remember the others.
Good. Did he eventually retire?
He actually went across the street. He worked in naval weapons and in torpedoes, and went across the street and worked for a firm in Washington, D.C. that was a naval weapons contractor. And he died about 10 years ago, lung cancer.
Did he actually complete his military career before transferring to a civilian job? Or?
Yes, he did.
Okay.
Yeah, he retired. He had about 22 years in, and he was a captain in the Navy, and his children were about to go to college, and so he stopped, retired, and went across the street.
The captain in the Navy is equivalent of a full bird colonel in
Yes.
the Army.
Yes.
Okay. So he had a successful career.
Mm-hmm.
Did you keep touch with him, in touch with him throughout the
Yes,
years?
he worked, he lived just outside Washington, D.C., and so we visited back and forth, and he had 4 children, and a couple of those are in Florida now, and so we have frequent contact with them.
When you started at UT, did you live on campus or at home? Or?
No, I lived at home.
Okay. And that was where then?
It was on Broadway,
Okay.
in the nursing home.
Did you ever live on campus?
I did for a time. When I was president of the fraternity, you were allowed free housing, and so for that year I lived on campus.
Were you one of those who obtained a degree before going to law school, or did you go 3 years and 3 years, as was the case for many people?
In my case, I went 4 years and finished the degree because at that time the Korean War was going on, and I wanted to get a degree before I left, and so I wasn't sure I would get back to law school, and so I did finish in business and got a degree, then went to law school.
What was your major in undergraduate school?
Finance, business administration.
Okay. And you graduated from undergraduate what year?
I graduated in 1954.
Okay. I understand that you became involved in campus politics somewhat.
I did.
Undergraduate.
I did, yeah. I was a political representative for my fraternity, which was Phi Gamma Delta.
You and I are fraternity brothers.
Yes, we are.
And I understand that you started your friendship with several people as a result of undergraduate school
I made
and
some
your
very
fraternity
close
life.
friends in and out of the fraternity, beginning in those college years.
Who are some of those friends with whom you've maintained relationships?
John Lockridge is a longtime friend. We met at the university. Hunter Cagle is another one. Tom Weiniger, Gene Switzer.
Of course, John and Hunter were, John's still practicing law,
Mm-hmm.
and Hunter just retired,
That's right.
and Mr. Weiniger passed away recently.
Right. Gene Switzer was also a lawyer and was with a New York firm and ended up, I think, in Savannah,
Okay.
and he's now deceased.
I've been told that you were involved in the running a cow for in the Miss UT contest while undergraduate.
I did do that.
Why don't you tell us about that story?
Okay. At that time, the fraternities and sororities pretty much dominated at least political life and social life at the university, and the independent students didn't have much interest or influence in campus activities. And the fraternities and sororities would organize themselves into political organizations, usually one, opposed to the other. And they would pass around the honors. One of the honors was Miss Tennessee. And if you were in a sorority in a particular political organization, you'd get the honors on a priority basis, and maybe you didn't get Miss Tennessee, but once every 10 years or so. Well, there was a member of the opposite political organization to us that rated our political organization, offered a sorority Miss Tennessee much earlier than they otherwise would have gotten it. And so they jumped ship and went to the other side. And that created a political imbalance. We had no chance to win any of the class offices, the president, vice president, or Miss Tennessee. So we decided we would run a cow for Miss Tennessee. I had looked up the rules, and there wasn't any requirement that you be a human being. There was no requirement that you be a University of Tennessee student. And so we ran, and of course we attracted the attention of the independent students. We parked the cow in our front yard, which was, the fraternity was on Cumberland Avenue, a very visible location. And the cow was named Deborah Bovine. And of course she won overwhelmingly. The independent students just loved it, and so it was a way for them to retaliate against the system, I suppose. But anyway, she won, and then they filed a challenge, and they were successful with the challenge. We argued, of course, that the rules didn't prohibit that, but we lost.
Okay. Did you ever have a sense that any of the women students took offense at
Well,
that?
I know the ultimate Miss Tennessee took offense at it. This was probably a little different time, but
Quite a bit. Did you enjoy your undergraduate
I did.
years?
Yeah, I did. Primarily because of the fraternity and the associations that I had there, and it was a way of introduction to activity on campus as well as a social outlet.
How'd you enjoy your time as president of the fraternity?
I enjoyed it. It was fun, yeah. There were a lot of competitions, athletic and otherwise. There was competition among the journalistic Enterprises, the Orange and White newspaper, the Volunteer Annual. I was one of the editors of that annual, and a lot of other things. So there's a lot to be involved in, and I had not been involved prior to that time to any extent.
What made you think about going into law or attending law school?
You know, when I was just starting college, I was going to go to engineering school, as my brother had. I had an interest in math and liked it, and had worked in construction projects, engineering projects, and liked that. So I thought about being a civil engineer and sort of following my brother. And I got a ride to the university on one of the first days I went with a lawyer. There was a lot of hitchhiking in that days, and I was hitchhiking to school down on Linesview Pike. This fellow picked me up, and he started talking to me about career, and he impressed me with his passion for the law, and invited me to his office. I went to his office, and he talked to me some more, and so I changed that first week or so to pre-law, and never changed after that.
You recall who that lawyer was?
I don't know who it was.
Where was his office?
He worked, I think he worked for the Testerman Group, the real estate title company, but I don't recall his name.
That's the family that Kyle Testerman.
Kyle Testerman and John Testerman.
John, okay. Kyle was later mayor of Knoxville.
Right. And Kyle was a good friend of mine.
Was it difficult to be admitted to the law school in that time frame?
Oh no, it was you had to have a C average. You did have and that's all. You did have a counseling session with whoever was in charge of admissions at the law school, who would try to advise you or whether you might make it or not. But basically what they did was they admitted everyone who applied who had that C average. There wasn't any LSAT then, and no admission test. And then they ran everybody off that they could in the first semester. So they would tell you when the freshman class, one of the first lectures was look to the right, look to the left, and neither one of those people will be there when you graduate. And that was about right. Our class had about a 66% attrition rate.
Were you on the quarter system then or semester?
We were on a quarter system.
I also attended the university, and I think we graduated about the same percentage in the 60s, about a third.
It's changed then. To go back to college years, I did tell you I was active in campus activities, but I also worked during that period of time. For 2 years, I worked at Fulton Silken, 3 to 11 shift down there. And most of the rest of the time, I had some sort of job or another during my student times.
Did you work during the school year?
Yeah, I worked the 3 to 11 shift for 2 years.
When did you find time to study? Working and being active on campus?
Yeah, late at night, different times.
How'd you enjoy your 3 years in law school?
I enjoyed it. Yeah, it was fun.
Did you go straight through, or did you?
I went straight through.
Okay. Were you active in activities while in law school?
I was active in the Bar Association there and the legal fraternity.
How'd you do in law school?
I did reasonably well.
Did you,
in sort of the top 10%.
Were you on law review or anything
No,
like that?
I wasn't. I didn't have the time to do that.
Will you continue to work while in law school?
Yes, I did.
What kind of work did you do then?
I worked at a mortuary, was a funeral attendant. I dug graves, What else did I do? I worked at the Student Center. I had another job too, but I can't
Okay.
escape me.
The any professors that you respected more than others, I should say, while in law school?
Well, I thought they had a very good faculty at the university when I was there, but there were people who stood out, and Forrest Lacey was one of them, and Professor Warner was another one. He later became dean of the law school, and Dix Noel was an eminent torts professor. He was a very fine academician. Probably wasn't as good a teacher as he was an academic, but he was an outstanding
He was.
person.
What kind of courses did you like in law school as opposed to others?
I like torts. I enjoyed torts. I later became active in practice in real estate, but I can't say that I liked real estate that much when I was in law school.
Now, upon graduation, did you go straight to work?
Yes, I did. I interviewed while I was in law school the last quarter, and ended up going to Oak Ridge. They didn't have any jobs in Knoxville to amount to anything at that time, and I really didn't want to end up in Knoxville, where I'd grown up. I wanted to go somewhere away. And so I went to Memphis and had a couple offers down there, but I ended up in Oak Ridge.
And what year was this that you started your
It was
legal career?
1957 in August of that year.
And what firm did you join?
The firm was Wilson and Joyce, and I was their first associate. There were 2 lawyers in Oak Ridge.
Now, Wilson and Joyce, tell us who the Wilson was.
Well, the Wilson was Frank Wilson, who he went to Oak Ridge as a solo practitioner. I think at that time there were only 2 lawyers in Oak Ridge when he went, and he had a little dorm room, was his first office there in 1946. And then I joined the firm. He encouraged Gene Joyce, who was a community activist, to go to law school, and he went to law school and graduated and joined Frank, and they became that firm, and I think they started the firm in 1952.
Okay.
And I joined them in 57.
Wilson became Judge Wilson.
He did in 1962. He was appointed by President Kennedy to the federal district judgeship in Chattanooga.
I never had the pleasure of being in front of him, but by all accounts, he was a great federal judge.
I think he had that reputation of being a federal judge. He was a great trial lawyer, too. I was his trial assistant for all the years before he left, and he was a really fine trial lawyer.
Those who may not know, what were some of his famous cases over which he presided as a federal judge?
Well, the Hoffa case is the one that stands out. There was a prosecution of Hoffa for jury tampering, and it was moved to Chattanooga. The tampering actually took place in Nashville, as it turned out, but it was moved to Chattanooga and tried there, and Hoffa was convicted there. That was I went down there for trial. Was about 3 weeks, and Frank was he was beleaguered by all sorts of motions and isolated. He only had 1 law clerk, and so we went down for sort of moral support. But it was a very interesting thing to see 20 lawyers lined up behind Hoffa and his defendants, and a real show. Jim Neal was the prosecutor, along with John J. Hooker's father. So it was real legal and political theater.
For those who, the younger generation who may not know, who was Jimmy Hoffa?
Jimmy Hoffa was a labor leader. He was a tough labor leader. allegations that he was connected with the mob at different times. It was the Teamsters that he was the leader of.
Later on, after he served prison time as a result of that conviction, he was later murdered, for those who don't know.
Yes, he was.
How long was Judge Wilson on the federal bench, do you recall?
I'm trying to think. He died when he was 65,
Okay.
so he must have been there about, and I think he must have been there about 20 years.
Okay.
He actually turned down a nomination for the Sixth Circuit. He decided that he was a real academic and a very intellectual man, but he decided he liked the trial work better and didn't want to get isolated on the bench.
Did you remain close to him while he...
I did.
Now, the other gentleman who was in that firm was Gene Joyce. I didn't know Gene, a fine man. Tell us about him.
Well, Gene was he was a very energetic, passionate sort of man. Very active. They called him Mr. Oak Ridge. Very active in all community activities out there, and as was Frank. Both of them were heavily involved in Oak Ridge community life and politics, and I couldn't have had two better mentors to go to. I think it's important to have that when you're a young lawyer and you're malleable and you're going to be influenced by whoever you associate with in practice. So I couldn't have been more fortunate in my choice of mentors.
After Judge Wilson took the bench, the federal bench, what did the firm's name become?
Well, for a short time, Bill Wilson, who was his brother in Knoxville, came out and sort of helped with the transition, but then it became Joyce, Anderson, and Meredith.
And how long did you stay with the firm?
I was there almost 30 years.
The two combined?
Yes.
So you practiced law almost 30 years?
I did.
And after the change in the name of the firm, I understand, at the risk of leading, you were the managing partner for most of those years.
I was.
Having been a managing partner of the firm, was that a difficult thing to do?
Well, it is. It's handling personnel primarily, and so it's somewhat difficult. And it's also managing the income of the firm and dealing with clients and recruiting clients.
What kind of work did you do in your early years as a lawyer?
Well, the reason for my going to Oak Ridge was that at the time I went there was no city. The federal government owned all the land. They had leased some of the land to churches, but primarily they owned it all. And so Congress had passed a Disposal Legislation Act which allowed the government to sell all the houses in Oak Ridge and the commercial property. And so I went there really to help with that real estate boom that was going to occur, and it did.
Were you involved in the politics of the Oak Ridge?
Yes, I was. Primarily what Gene and Frank were interested in, and what most Oak Ridgers were interested in, was the income of the city from the federal government, both from the Department of Energy and the contractors at Oak Ridge, Union Carbide and Lockheed Martin Marietta and others. And so the interest was in the senators and the congressmen for that district. And there was not much interest really in state government because the source of income for the town was the government and its contractors. And so we devoted a lot of time to campaigns for the Senate and for Congress. Oak Ridge was an interesting town when I went there. There was 30,000 people, 3,000 PhDs, and more of the PhDs, the graduate level, lived in Oak Ridge than perhaps a machinist or that sort of grade of people. So it was a very interesting town, a very interesting contrast to outside Oak Ridge, to Clinton and the other communities, which were more agriculturally oriented, and so it was an interesting place to practice because of that.
For those who don't know, where was the courthouse in Anderson County?
Well, it was in Clinton. Clinton was the county seat.
Right. And I won't talk about myself, but yeah, I've been in juries there where, because you brought this up, where you might have 7 or 8 people with masters and doctorate degrees, and the others might be farmers and blue-collar workers.
That's
So
exactly
interesting juries we would have.
Actually correct. Yeah, very correct.
Well, how did your legal career evolve after you were initially in real estate type of matters?
But yes, when I went there, it was beginning real estate practice, wrecks, and divorce. That was the practice. A little misdemeanor criminal work. And as the town grew, and the city incorporated the next year in 1958, as the town grew, then there were newspapers, radio stations, banks, and credit unions, and we were fortunate enough to represent banks, credit unions, newspaper, hospital. We sort of grew up with the town.
You, I know, represented the city of Oak Ridge for many years as its lawyer.
Yes, we did.
How long did you
Well,
do that?
they had a city attorney. In fact, Eugene Joyce was their first city attorney. And after that time, they, had a house counsel, and we did most of their litigation work. So we were, contract counsel.
And then I know later on, for many years, you did a lot of medical malpractice work.
I did.
And who was your primary client?
The Oak Ridge Hospital, the Methodist Hospital there.
And how many years did you do that?
Probably 15 or 20.
My recollection is that was a major part of your work in your last few years.
It was. I did some asbestos work at that time, and did some arson defense, and did a little plaintiff's personal injury, but that took a lot of my practice.
How did you enjoy the defending the hospital in those malpractice cases?
Well, it was interesting work. More challenging, more demanding than some of the other parts of practice.
Why was that?
Well, it was just a little more complicated. There were experts involved. The law was evolving then. We had the medical malpractice review boards beginning. The hurdles were a little higher for plaintiffs to climb because of the legislation involved and where experts could come from.
Some of those cases, if I recall, and you've told me, involved very serious injuries.
They did.
So-called bad baby cases,
Yeah, we
if you
had some
will.
baby cases.
Were those particularly challenging?
They were, yeah. It's very sympathetic situations. And
did you actually try some of those to verdict?
I did try 2 or 3 of those. They were long trials.
Okay. During this period when you were active as a lawyer, I also understand you were active in the community.
I was.
In civic endeavors.
Yeah.
Tell us some of the endeavors that you're involved.
I was a member of the Oak Ridge Charter Commission. We had a 12-person city council, and it had occurred when the city was formed, sort of a default, because they couldn't agree on the number of people. So they ended up choosing the school districts, and there were 12 school districts, so they had 12 councilmen. So we were the first elected charter commission, and we were trying to reduce the size of council and change it somewhat from all district to a combination of district and at large, and that's what we ended up recommending. And it was soundly defeated because Labor was against it. So I learned one of my first political lessons in that charter commission.
Tell us some of the other activities in which you were involved.
I was
civic
involved in the
realm.
YMCA out there as president of the YMCA. I was head of the Mental Health Foundation. Actually, I represented, as one of my clients, I represented the Mental Health Center out there, Mental Health Hospital now. Okay. And that came about, I suppose, because of my past experience at Eastern State Hospital. And, you know, I was in JCs, I was in all sorts of civic activities, Rotary.
You're not telling us all the story, but you were in the Oak Ridge Community Arts Center, involved
Yes.
in that, the Chamber of Commerce,
Yes.
Board of Trustees of the First Methodist Church,
Yes.
and many others.
Yes.
Very active in your community. Were you, it's no secret you're a lifelong Democrat.
None at all, no. My mother was a yellow dog Democrat, so.
Well, you've been accused of that. So, did you?
Well, I voted for a Republican, so I'm not completely yellow dog.
Okay. During your legal career, were you active in Democratic circles?
I was. I sort of waxed and waned. I would get active in a political campaign, and then they would pull me back to work. The first one that I actually managed was Ross Bass in 1964. I managed a campaign for him.
And who was he running against?
He was running against Frank Clement. He was running for the United States Senate. He was a congressman in the 6th District prior to that time, and he decided that he wanted to run for the Senate. And, you know, as background, we were interested in whoever wanted to run for the Senate, so I managed his campaign.
How did that come out?
He won against Clement in the primary, ran in the general election against Howard Baker. He beat Howard Baker by 50,000 votes. The Clement machine and his machine actually just split the Democratic Party down the center. And so in 1966, he ran against Clement again and lost in the primary. Then Clement ran against Baker and lost.
What were some other campaigns in which you were involved?
Well, I said it waxed and waned. It waned for a while.
Okay.
They didn't let me, they put me back to work at the law firm, and so I didn't manage any political campaigns until 1982.
And what was that?
That was a campaign for the United States Senate by Jim Sasser. That was his second campaign.
What was your position in that campaign?
I was a district manager. These are, you know, these are local positions that I was involved with. I was never a statewide campaign manager or anything like that. And then I handled a district campaign for Al Gore against Victor Ashe in 1984. And then I did have a larger role in the campaign than district. And then in 1986, I managed a campaign for Ned McWhorter for governor.
Okay.
Our first foray into state politics.
What was it about politics that intrigued you? Or
I don't know. It was just to me, it was an organizational challenge. It was a competition, a game of sorts, and it was just very exciting. You didn't know the outcome, and things could happen that were, you didn't expect come along. You had to react to them, and so it was just an interesting thing to do, aside from your philosophical bent, how you felt about the candidate. And obviously, before you agreed to work for them, they had to pass that test.
you mentioned your mother was a strong Democrat.
She was.
And let's talk about her again and digress a moment. We left her when she'd started this nursing home business many years earlier. What did she do after that?
She was active in geriatrics. She was a member of went to the first White House Conference on Aging. She ultimately became president of the American Nursing Home Association. She was a lobbyist for nursing homes in the state legislature in Tennessee. She was very active in that field.
You mentioned that she formed a partnership with some others to form a string of nursing homes. Is that the right terminology?
Yes.
And how did that develop?
She was managing her own nursing home, and she was active in the Nursing Home Association, and there was a doctor and a contractor in Memphis who were interested in starting a chain, and they were attracted to her because she had worked with the legislature and also was knowledgeable. And so she became a part of their partnership. And so they built a 100-bed home in Knoxville, and they built 2 more in Tennessee, 100-bed homes, and then they began to expand to Arkansas. And she had some differences with them over the administration. She was the administrator of the Knoxville home, the 100-bed home, that involved what she thought it was a services issue. She wanted more services for the patients, and they wanted to make money. So she fell out with them, and so she was a member of the group, and when they were expanding to Arkansas, they needed her signature to expand there. They were going to build 2 more, and she refused to do it. And of course there was, you were on a several $million-dollar loan, and I advised her to go ahead and do it. Why don't you sign it? You can't pay it anyway. So, and ultimately, when you remove yourself from the firm, you'll have the benefits. You would not do it. And so she left the firm and ultimately sold her stock.
When did she pass away?
1989. She was 78.
Okay. This is probably a good point to take a break, and we'll take a break.
Okay.
Mr. Anderson, we're back on the record again
All right.
after taking a break. Back to your law firm years. First of all, what was your starting salary? You remember when you started?
$300 a month.
Okay. And
Jack Draper and I, in our class, we were the highest paid.
what are some of your recollections and of being in that law firm for all those years? What are you most proud of?
Well, it had, I learned shortly after I got there what an outstanding reputation it had in the community and with other lawyers. And one of its characteristics was a very strong work ethic. It was known for superb preparation of lawsuits, investigations. They would stand on the street corner at about the same time an accident happened, the next day and the next day and the next day, and just did exhaustive kind of work, and so they were known for that work ethic. And I used to tell the story about Frank Wilson. I worked with him most closely, and we worked every day of the week, and we worked Sunday afternoons. And the only reason we didn't work Sunday mornings is because he's religious. He went to church. And so for most of the time he was there, we worked that schedule, 6.5 days a week. Gene was somewhat less, but you know, about a 6-day week was normal there.
Did you follow that schedule throughout most of your legal career?
Well, I don't know that on Saturdays, we would always be down there on Saturday morning, so it was, you know, 5.5 days a week and works into the afternoon sometimes, and then if you had trials on Monday, you worked some on Sunday, so, you know.
Okay. Let's talk about Pandy for a while.
Okay.
Tell me when you first met Pandy, your wife.
I met her on a tennis court in Oak Ridge.
And you've been married how long to Pandy?
We've been married 28 years.
Okay. What's her full name? What was her maiden name?
It's Andrea Anderson, and Farmer was her maiden name.
And what's her, where was she from originally?
She's from England.
Okay.
She was born in London during the London Blitz in the 40s, and grew up in Cheshire. Her father was a very eminent nuclear scientist. He was in charge of safety at reactors for Great Britain and its territories. So, and he traveled to Oak Ridge a lot, and so we saw a lot of him there before he died.
I know y'all have recently sold your lake house.
We have,
And
yeah.
I'll come back to that at the end, but where are you living now?
We live out in River Sound. We live on Fort Loudon Lake in a villa, limited lot line development.
Now, how many children do you have?
We have 7
Okay.
between us, and we have 9 grandchildren.
Okay. Where are your children?
They're scattered around. They're in Baltimore, in New York City, and Arizona, Arkansas, Nashville, and Oak Ridge.
You keep up with them?
Yeah, we
much?
do. We
Okay.
do. We visit them often, and they come to see us often. So.
How about your grandchildren?
We have only one that's local. One, the youngest one, who's 2 years old, is in Oak Ridge, and my son Blake's daughter.
Okay.
And the next closest is Nashville. Sean is my grandson, and Sean is maybe he's 9 now, and my daughter lives there. She's a lawyer there.
The at some point you became a appellate judge. Tell us why you decided to seek to become an appellate judge, and when it occurred.
It occurred in 1987, and it didn't really. I didn't really think about it that much. I don't think, but there was a sudden resignation by Judge Parrott, and I had been thinking about cutting back somewhat in law practice and or doing something else. Just thinking about it, and that opportunity came, and I decided that I'd like to do it. And so I applied for it.
Had you ever sought public office before then?
Nothing other than the Charter Commission, which was an elected position, citywide in Oak Ridge.
Had you ever thought about being a trial judge?
I thought more about being a trial judge, but there wasn't, any opportunity at that time, and so it just wasn't anything that came up.
For those who might not know, who was Judge Parrott?
Judge Parrott was a judge on the Court of Eastern Division of the Court of Appeals from from Strawberry Plains, Tennessee, just the east of Knoxville.
Tell us how the system worked when you became an appellate court appeals judge. How that worked at that time. I know we've had different ways of becoming appellate judges, and it's changed over the years. But just tell us how that worked
at that time. There was a statewide nominating commission composed of components of the political parties. In other words, there was a certain percentage of Republicans, a certain percentage of Democrats that had to be on the commission. And it was appointed primarily by the legislature. There may have been some other appointments. And there were selected groups that it had to come from, like the Bar Association and other groups. And so they had this nominating commission. I've forgotten how many, probably 12 or so. And you applied, and you had a hearing, and you had an interview with them, and then they chose what they considered to be the top 3. In my case, 14 applied because it had been 10 or 12 years since a new judge had been on the court, and so a lot of people lined up. And I was fortunate enough to be in the top 3, and then from that top 3, the governor chooses one. He can pass over and go to the other, another time, but he chooses one, and fortunately he chose me, and so I went on the Court of Appeals.
Do you recall who the other 2 nominees were?
Jimmy Baxter from Knoxville was one of them, and there was a gentleman from Chattanooga who was a lawyer and had been a legislator, and his name escapes me. Those were the 3.
Jimmy Baxter, of course, was a federal attorney general.
He was.
Assistant attorney general for many years, now retired, and one of the first successful Afro-American lawyers in this area.
Right.
Very highly competent man. Well, who was governor? Who was the governor who appointed you to that position?
Governor Ned McWhirter.
Okay.
Appointed me.
And again, this was what year?
This was March of 1987.
And at that time, how many? This was the Eastern Section Court of Appeals. How many judges were there in each section?
There were 12 judges total, 4 in each section, 4 in the middle, 4 in the west,
Okay.
4 in the east.
Later on became 5.
No, it had been 3. It had been 9. 3
Okay.
in the middle, 3 in the east, 3 in the west. It expanded in the late 70s to 12, and it's still 12.
Still 12, I'm sorry. And you recall who was on the bench with you when you first?
Herschel Franks had been the most recent appointee, and he was appointed in sometime between 74 and 78. Houston Goddard was appointed before that, and Cliff Sanders was the 3rd one, and he was from Kingsport.
Okay. What are your? Did you find it difficult going straight from a trial practice to being an appellate judge?
It was difficult in a personal sense. It was difficult because it was isolating. Your friendships with lawyers were no longer the same, even close friends. It was different, and you weren't as close. And certainly the camaraderie that you had with the bar, with lawyers, you didn't have anymore. And you didn't have anything really to substitute for that on the Court of Appeals. You did on the Supreme Court, but you didn't on the Court of Appeals. And I remained active in my community, and so had an outlet there, but I didn't have an outlet with the bar, who were my closest friends.
Did you divorce yourself from them, or did it just happen naturally?
Well, it was a little of both. They treated me differently, and there were certain things, that I couldn't do. I couldn't have a close association with one lawyer or another. if I did, I'd have to recuse myself on cases. So
Did you continue to socialize with your lawyer friends?
I did to a very limited extent. To those that were closest to me, like John Lockridge, I continued, and of course, if he ever had a case there, I would recuse myself. But that's probably the only one.
Did you have to submit yourself to any kind of training when you first started your work in the Court of Appeals?
Well, the nationwide training for appellate judges is at New York University. Now there's another competitor in out in Nevada, which is more active with trial judges. Began with trial judges, but NYU was the training ground for appellate judges all over the country, and I went there. They usually wanted you to serve a year before you went, and I did that, and I went. And then I went back again when I was on the Supreme Court to another graduate group. It's an advanced group. And then I became a part of their Institute of Judicial Administration there, and still there.
Do you have any idea how many cases or opinions you wrote while on the Court of Appeals?
No, I don't. But my guess is somewhere around 200. Our workload was around 65 or 70 a year. So I think of major opinions, it's probably around 200.
Okay. You heard your arguments at that time right behind our building here.
Yes.
In the now closed Court of Appeals Supreme Court building.
Right.
Did you enjoy those years?
I did. The judges were close. I remember when I had to run for election. Of course, that was part of the plan. Election plan is that you had to run for election in the next biennial. So I ran for election in '88, a little more than a year later. And that time it was the tradition for Court of Appeals judges not to campaign. And so I talked to Joe Duncan, who was a judge on the Court of Criminal Appeals, and to Houston Goddard, who was on the Court of Appeals, both of whom I was close to, about campaigning. And they said, no, you shouldn't do that. They said, you're going to get exactly the same amount of votes, whether you do or not, and you might hurt yourself. So, of course, I didn't listen to them. I'm not good at that. And I went ahead and campaigned, primarily in East Tennessee. I probably visited about 25 counties, and just went around, did a courthouse tour, and that sort of thing. And sure enough, I got just the same amount of votes as they did, and they didn't get out of their offices.
For those who might not know, when you had to campaign in 1988,
yes,
was that against someone else, or were you just
no, it was
up or down vote?
Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't explain
The
that.
system's changed over the
It's a
years.
yes/no vote.
Okay.
You ran against
Right.
yourself, essentially. And you had to get more than 50% yeses.
Okay.
And if you didn't, you were out. That was the end of you.
Right. And you were on the Court of Appeals how many years?
From March of '87 to September of '90, so a little more than 3.5, I guess.
Did you ever miss the practice of law once you
I
sat in
did.
that position?
I did. I missed the people. I missed the association, and to some extent, I missed the adversarial part of it. The competition part of it. But primarily, it was the people. I've heard described in the building that you refer to, which is across the street from where we are. You could walk down the hall and you might see one person or you might see nobody. And of course, that's not true in the Anderson County Courthouse or the Knox County Courthouse. You're going to see a lot of people you know. And so it was very different.
Well, in 1990, in 1990, you made a decision to run for the Supreme Court.
Right.
Why don't you tell us how the system worked at that time and how you became
Well, at that
Supreme Court Justice?
At that time, it was popular election for the Supreme Court. The intermediate appellate courts, Court of Appeals, Court of Criminal Appeals, had the yes/no system, but the Supreme Court was still in popular election, and so you had to campaign for the Democratic or Republican Party nomination. In the Democratic case, it was the Democratic Executive Committee that chose you, and the members were located all over the state in senatorial districts. And I'm trying to think of the number. I think there were 64 Executive Committee members, and so essentially you traveled all across the state to visit those members and tell them you were interested in your qualifications and see if you could get their vote. And so I was running against an incumbent Supreme Court Justice, Justice Cooper, and Herschel Franks was also in that race. He was a Court of Appeals judge along with me, and so there were two of us running against him. And in January, they had the vote, so we started campaigning, say, in the fall, and had the vote, and I was fortunate enough to be selected. Herschel Franks had dropped out of the race sometime in December, and so it was just between Justice Cooper and I.
Now, there was another contest, in another seat at that time. Is that correct?
That's right. Well, there were three open seats. There was another contested one against an incumbent, Judge Harbinson, who was an incumbent Supreme Court Justice, and Sissy Daughtry, who was on the Court of Criminal Appeals for many years, was running against him. Okay. And one of the things that had happened in the Democratic primary, they changed the rules, I think back in the early 70s, which required that half of the Democratic Executive Committee people be women. And so it was composed half women, half men. And she ran and she won against Harbinson.
And what about the third?
The third seat was an open seat. Fones was an incumbent Supreme Court Justice, but he retired. And so that was an open seat, and Lyle Reed won that seat, and there was opposition. I've forgotten who, but...
Now, so you're nominated or selected by the Democratic Party.
Right.
And did you actually have a race against any Republicans?
We didn't end up having one. One of the things I should add is that the Democratic Party had a merit commission which selected the candidates. There was competition to see who would be nominated before we got to the stage where we were running against the incumbent. And so there were perhaps 12 or so that were vying for these spots to oppose the incumbent. And so they had a merit commission that sort of wintered it down to the ones of us who did run.
Did you expect to have to run against a Republican?
I fully expected to, because particularly in East Tennessee, the tradition had been that there was often Republican opposition to the person from East Tennessee. East Tennessee's Republican, and although it's a statewide race, Irma Greenwood, for example, ran from East Tennessee, and there have been other Republicans that have run from East Tennessee. So I did expect opposition, but as it turned out, there was a lot of talk, but no one ended up running.
So you became a Supreme Court justice.
I became a Supreme Court justice. We actually had planned a campaign, and so we did visit about 70 counties. The incumbent members of the Supreme Court, Frank DeRoda and Charles O'Brien, and 3 new ones, and we went to about 70 counties over that summer of 1990.
Okay. And you were on the Supreme Court how many years?
16 years.
Okay. Recently retired.
Mm-hmm.
When you first started in that position as a Supreme Court justice, how well did you know the other justices on the court initially?
I didn't. I knew them a little bit from judicial conferences, you know, but hadn't been on the Court of Appeals that long, and so I didn't know them well. I knew Frank DeRoda probably better than the others.
Okay, tell us again who the first 5, the other 4 when you first went on the.
When I went on the court, the 2 holdover justices were Justice Frank DeRoda from Nashville and Justice Charles O'Brien from Crossville. And Lyle Reed was elected from the Western Division, and Sissy Daughtry was elected from the Middle Division, and I was elected from East Tennessee.
Okay. At that time, how was the Chief Justice selected?
It's always been selected by the members of the court.
And what were the terms, so to speak?
Well, in the so-called 74 court, the 74 to 80 court, and the next court as well, decided they wanted to split the terms between them. So they divided it by 5, and each of them served 19 months. And that was true of the court up until 1990. And the Futures Commission, which later met in the 90s, recommended 4-year terms. We didn't decide it in 90, but we decided it ought to be longer than 19 months. They would not split it up among the members, and that it would be an election by the court of that person they thought that was best able to lead the court. So Lyle Reed was the first chief, and I was the second.
And
well, I take that back. Charles O'Brien served for a short time, about 30 days or so before he resigned from the court.
And how many times did you serve as Chief Justice?
5 times.
And tell me those years.
The years were 1994 through 2001, and then again for a short period of time in 2005. We didn't have a full complement at that time of the court, and so they decided they wanted to have at least all the members express their so I served again in that interim period of time before they elected Justice Barker as Chief Justice.
So if my calculations correct, you were Chief Justice about 7 years?
About 6 years.
6 years,
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Before we go into some procedures and cases, tell us what the duties are of Chief Justice and the burdens.
Well, there are internal duties associated with running, the conferences of the court, assigning cases to each member, and that becomes interesting at times because some courts assign cases in advance. We never did. We always heard the argument, and we wanted each judge to be what we called a hot judge, that is, to know all about the case, and so we didn't assign until afterwards, and the Chief Justice did the assigning. Well, sometimes the views would change from, what you talked about before. After the argument, would change, and so what you had down for assignments would shift on you, and so you had to juggle a little bit. But that was one of the responsibilities of the Chief Justice, to assign cases. And you also run the calendar. You set the calendar up and be sure everybody's where they belong, including accommodations. And we traveled a lot, as you know. The Constitution requires the Supreme Court to go to each Grand Division, and you actually have a Supreme Court building in each Grand Division. And we added Memphis to that travel schedule. And then we began the Scales program, which was more extensive travel. And we also held the swearing-in ceremonies in each part of the state, which had not been done before. Everybody had to go to Nashville to be sworn in if you want to be sworn in before the Supreme Court. So we added that to travel across the state to do that. So a lot of travel.
How much additional time was required to be a Chief Justice as opposed to?
It took
regular member?
about between 60 and 70% of my time to do that. And I did not have some Supreme Courts reduce the load on the Chief Justice. In fact, some do not write opinions. But I wrote a full 1/5.
During the period that you were on the court,
And that wasn't, let me add,
okay.
everybody did that. It wasn't just me.
During the period that you were on the court, tell us the effect of changes in technology, if any, on your duties and your ability to perform your duties as a justice.
We had, when we began, one of the things we wanted to do was to computerize the trial court so that the reporting from those courts to us, we'd have accurate reporting, and we'd know about caseloads, and we'd know how cases were moving. And I was sent to Arizona to a conference about 10 days after we were first elected to try to learn about that and institute it. And so that began, I suppose, within the first year or so after we were elected. We began that process, and it's still ongoing. After 16 years, we're still trying to do it, and there are a lot of problems with it, a lot of complications, but it is a lot better than it was in terms of the Supreme Court knowing where the caseloads are, where the problems are, and so forth.
How about the workings of the court itself? Did you go into teleconferencing as opposed to actual meetings sometimes? We
did. I had a friend that I played tennis with, Bob Levy, who's the vice president at UT, and they were doing video conferencing, and of course their campuses are spread across. He told me about it, and I thought, well, that'll work for us. And we, at that time, traveled to Nashville a lot just to have an administrative meeting, just to have a business meeting. So we did that, bought the equipment, and set up a station in Memphis and Jackson and Nashville and Knoxville, and now Chattanooga. So
has that been beneficial?
It's very beneficial
as far as efficiency
in terms of cutting the travel down. We use it for, as you're aware, we have a lot of commissions. You served on one of those commissions, and those commissions can now meet using the video equipment. So it's a lot more, it's economical. You save the travel and the meals for the members that had to come to Nashville before, and they can do it from the video. So it's also the same thing for the court. The court's travel schedule was cut down somewhat.
Before we go into talk about some cases and other matters, it's well known that you were involved and a leader in changes in the judicial system, formulation of commissions, Scales program, things of that nature, progress in the the function of the judiciary. Why don't you tell us some of the things of which you're most proud in that aspect?
One of the things that I had a concern about with regard to the Supreme Court was at least a reputation, whether it was deserved or not, that it was ivory towerish. It had a reputation with the legislature that it was across the street and never had any association with them. And of course, the legislature determined at least their financial fate, if not other things as well. So I thought that the Supreme Court ought to remove itself from its ivory tower. And more than that, the public need to be educated about what it did. The Supreme Court and the other courts can only survive if the public trusts the courts. And one way to engender that trust is for them to understand what we do and how we do it. So the first project was cameras in the courtroom. We had a lot of opposition to that. A lot of traditionalists thought that it was inappropriate. And so we decided to do it. Florida had been the leader in that area. We decided to do a one-year program to satisfy the critics. After that 1 year, our trial judges pretty much adopted it. We had probably 70% opposition to begin with, and after the 1 year, it was down to about 20%. We still had some holdouts, but it worked, and none of the objections were really valid in actual practice. So cameras were helpful. My vision of it was that we would have it on cable television, and you could watch an entire trial on cable television, and some other states have that. We could never get that done in Tennessee, but we did have it in some cases. It operated in Middle Tennessee and Nashville and some death penalty cases over there, and it was a very well, a number of people watched it, and it had commentators, much like court television. And that's what I envisioned for the whole state. It hadn't happened yet. I hope it does, because I think it's like watching your city council meeting or, on cable television. So, but it was a beginning. And the other thing that was a public education was the Scales program, and that was to educate high school students about what the Supreme Court did. And so we would take our docket to counties. We had a bench that was built, a portable bench, and we would travel to one county to another. And it was an extensive program of pre-education. We had lawyers that would go out to the schools. We had actual cases. We did not change the cases around or anything. There were actual Supreme Court cases that we'd ask the lawyers if they'd be willing to go to that county or that site to do it, and we very rarely had anybody turn us down. And so we operated that program. I think we've been before about 20,000 students now, and I've even forgotten the numbers, but 35 or 40 places we've traveled in the last 10 years or 12 years.
That's been well received, I know, by everybody. I don't know anybody who does not.
It won an American Bar Association award for education.
Now you've alluded to some commissions that you were involved in instituting or starting. You want to tell us about those?
Well, we have a number of commissions. One, which was Justice Harbison's, he began it. It was his idea. It was the Board of Professional Responsibility, discipline for lawyers. When I was a lawyer practicing in Anderson County, the discipline was local. And so if you had a disciplinary problem, you had to resolve it within the bar. Well, you can imagine the difficulties with that, trying to do that. And occasionally you would have a suit brought by the Bar Association and handled by some lawyer or another for disbarment when it got that severe. It was a very poor system. and the Board of Professional Responsibility with a professional running it began to investigate disciplinary problems. We have a Court of Judiciary which does the same thing with judges, and if a judge has a disciplinary problem, it's investigated and there's a hearing process for it. CLE, Continuing Legal Education, was another commission that was adopted, and mandatory education was required for lawyers, and ethics was added, an added component to that as time went by. So we've had a number of commissions. It seems like they expand all the time.
Did any of, we talked about some of your background, and particularly your mother's work in the mental health field. Did that affect any of your policies? Or It began, I guess, in Oak Ridge, where I was interested in representing the Mental Health Center and also head of a mental health foundation. The foster child experience led me to form a foster care commission to try to, one of the goals was to investigate how long people were in foster care, how quickly they could be moved out and be adopted, and how parental terminations could occur, all that sort of thing. At one time it was a very slow process, and from what I read, you still have problems with children being in foster care, shifting from one foster care parent to another one, and not adoptable. What Williams has done here with television is a really interesting and rewarding thing. And what he's done is to publicize the plight of kids who are up for adoption, and as my understanding is they have a very high success rate as a result of his programs about children who want to be adopted. And he was telling me a story one time about I think there were 5 children, and there was a real problem. They didn't think they could get anybody to adopt 5 children. And I've forgotten how many applicants. He said they had 10 or 12 applicants to adopt all 5 of those children. For those who don't know, you're talking about Bill Williams.
Yes.
Who, very fine man, who still is with WBIR, I think.
Channel 10.
At least on a part-time basis, was a newscaster for many, many years for them. I understand also that you appointed commissions for gender and racial fairness. Is that correct?
I did.
Tell us about that.
Well, the Bar Association had done a study which demonstrated that there was gender bias all across the state. And although there had not been a commission investigating it, there also was racial bias across the state in the legal system. And so 2 commissions were appointed to look into that, to see what could be done about it. And those operated for 2 or 3 years, reported, and suggested a program. And I don't think the program was completely adopted, but I think a lot of progress was made in both areas.
I was going to ask you, do you see, there always will be some bias and all that, but do you think those 2 areas have come a long way in your tenure on the Supreme Court?
I think they have. I think they have. Maybe not because of those commissions, but just because of, I think the commissions helped because they identified the problem and identified solutions and tried to engage law firms and others and to help them solve the problem.
While on the court, tell us about how the collegiality of the members of the court and your relationship with other justices.
Well, it's interesting. It's a 5-member court, the Supreme Court is. The Constitution of 1835 identified that it ought to be 5 members. It's never changed. Pretty obviously, if you look at states across the United States, most states that have our population either have 7 or 9 members. And so, of course, opening the judicial article up, some people think it's a dangerous thing to do, and that's what would be necessary to change it. So we have 5 members, and it is more collegial. Those people that have a larger court, 9 or more, is less collegial. They have less contact with each other. We, because we're in different parts of the state, we probably have less opportunity than some of the others who require all their justices to live in the capital. Atlanta, you know, the Georgia folks live in Atlanta, the Ohioans live in Columbus. If they want to commute from out, they can, but pretty much they have to be there 5 days a week. So, and we're one of the few states that has their justices scattered all across the state.
Do you think the collegiality of with your fellow justices is important in the process?
It's very important. It's very important to get along. Sometimes you have maybe some short-term problems, but in my years on the court, I thought people got along very well, and it certainly helped the process of deciding cases to get along.
In light of some recent occurrences in the process, how do you feel about the process of selecting justices now? How's it working?
Well, I thought it worked pretty well up until recently, and I've heard Governor Bredesen comment that he thinks the structure shouldn't be changed. At one point, my understanding was that he wanted to change it, but he is not so interested in changing the structure as he is the people that are in the structure. So I think it's a good system. I think it's the best system. If you look at other states, at Ohio and Texas and the other states that have popular elections for the Supreme Court and have to raise $4 or $5 million from special interest groups, our particular system looks better and better all the time.
You mentioned when you, at least when you started in the Court of Appeals, that there was estrangement with some of your friends. How did that change any when you became a Supreme Court justice? Became worse or better, or what?
I don't think it changed the relationship so much, but there were a lot more outlets for me to deal with the public. The Supreme Court really has a duty and a requirement to be at functions and go across the state and travel and engage the public, and so that helped a lot.
I know that you spoke a lot, and how did you like doing that?
I liked it pretty well. It requires a fair amount of work to get the speeches ready, and you're invited more places than you can go. So, but I liked it. I thought it was a part of the obligation of the Supreme Court to educate people about what we were doing and why we were doing it.
Did you have to write your own speeches, or did you have help with your clerks?
Pretty much. I wrote my own, yeah.
Okay. There's been some, I'm on a commission you mentioned. How do you think specialization is working? If you want to comment on that.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how it's working.
I know very few lawyers, percentage-wise, are seeking to become certified. Is that?
That's my understanding. Why that is, I don't know exactly.
Okay.
But I don't think it's how they envisioned that it was going to work out.
Okay. Well, okay. Let's talk about some of your cases in general terms and specifically. What do you think some of the most important cases were decided while you were on the bench? I know the first one was McIntyre.
McIntyre was decided pretty early in pretty early in our tenure. It was a comparative negligence case. The legislature had considered the question of whether or not whether there should be comparative negligence, and had not acted for a period of about 20 years. I think Justice DeRota has described in his video tape the process by which we finally came to it. There had been 3 votes in favor of it for a fairly long time on the Supreme Court, and but they had a rule that required unanimous consent on the old, what we call the old court before us, and we didn't. So it came to voting on comparative negligence, and all of us were for some form of it or another. It was linking liability to fault.
Okay.
And so McIntyre was probably the one of the most important civil cases that was decided during that 16 years.
Well, I think by far, being a practicing lawyer, trial lawyer, it's the most significant case in the civil aspect of trial.
Now, to explain a little bit, if you were guilty, if you were an injured person, and you were guilty of any fault at all, contributory negligence, you were barred from recovery. And what McIntyre did was assess the amount of your fault and allow recovery if you were over 49%.
Okay.
I mean, under 49%. And so it linked, to some extent, liability and fault. The pure form of that, which we did not adopt, would allow you to be 99% negligent and still have a 1% recovery. Still be able to recover for your injuries, that 1% that's left.
It's my perception that initially a lot of people and lawyers thought that this would favor the plaintiff's bar. I don't think that's the case necessarily. When you did away with joint and several liability, it seemed to me it made the system better for everyone. That's my perception.
Some of the deep pocket defendants went away.
Right. How do you think, in retrospect, McIntyre is perceived now by the legal community as a whole?
Well, I don't know how they perceive it, but we thought in the beginning it was a fair approach, fair to both sides, not just the plaintiffs, but plaintiffs and defendants.
Yeah.
And I think it's worked out that way.
I think it has too, overall. I'll tell us some others, the most significant cases in your tenure.
Well, as you're aware, there are 5 million cases a year in Tennessee if you count the traffic ones and all of that. The 2 intermediate appellate courts handle about 2,000 a year, and we take 100 a year. So everything that we take is an important case. It's certainly important to the litigants, and you're reluctant a little bit to identify what's more important than the others. But if you think in terms of impact, certainly McIntyre had an impact. I think the small schools case against McWhirter, which held unconstitutional the method of funding schools and required that the legislature adopt a system that would give a substantial education to every child in the state and not leave any out. The former funding system was based on a sales tax return, so if you didn't have a shopping center, if you were in Hancock County or some other place, you only got the money based on sales tax return. If you were in Knox County, which had a lot of retail activity and generated a lot of sales tax, perhaps a better example is Sevier County, which has the highest return in the state, then you're a lot better off. So we thought that was a fair way to go about it, and the legislature did adopt a plan which is now being changed again, the so-called BEP plan, but there was a trilogy of cases. The last one was a school teacher salary component of the BEP, which the legislature left out because they thought it cost too much. And we required that to be put in. So I thought that was a very important case in terms of its impact on school children across the state.
Others that come to mind that you thought were most significant?
There are others. But I think those are the two most important, perhaps.
One other case in the civil realm, if you will, was the Jordan case, which I personally thought impacted values of these wrongful death cases. You want to tell us about the Jordan case?
Well, I prefer not to get into, maybe I mentioned in the past, Supreme Court justices don't talk about their opinions because if you try to interpret the opinion and you have different justices going around doing it, invariably it's going to be different or perceived as different by different people. And so if you just leave it, read the opinion, that's what it is. And so I prefer not to talk about the language of the cases
Very well.
and deal with the overall impact.
Okay. How many opinions do you think you authored in your 16 years on the Corps?
Well, my clerks say that I wrote 3,500 overall. I never counted them up, so I don't know.
Okay. And how many cases do you think in that 16-year period were decided by the Supreme Court?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't have a feel for it.
There came a time when the rules changed, so to speak, and you did not have to decide workers' compensation appeals. Did that help?
In 1994, we were able to persuade the legislature to adopt workers' compensation panels, and the whole court did not have to hear workers' compensation. Up until that time, those first 4 years, our docket was 70% of it was workers' compensation cases. We also had some specialized jurisdictional requirements where the legislature had said we needed to hear teacher tenure appeals. In one case, we needed beer board appeals. And so all of that jurisdiction was removed from the Supreme Court, and we became a certiorari court. That is, a court that will only hear something if permission is granted by the court. And so you could turn down whatever you wanted to, except for capital cases. And capital cases always had to come to the Supreme Court.
What have been the most difficult kind of cases for you to decide?
Death penalty cases and child custody, parental termination. Those areas are the most difficult.
How many executions have there been since you?
I participated in 2 One where there was a trial court in Nashville had stopped the execution, and so 30 minutes before, I had to call the warden and tell him to go ahead. And then another one that I was involved in, I called the warden and told him to stop it 30 minutes before. The Nashville Tennessean did an interview with us about those two cases. Sort of interesting reading.
How much toll did that take on you?
It was tough, not easy.
You mentioned child custody and cases. Why were they so difficult?
Well, they just, any case involving a child, maybe it's my own experience, I don't know, but
Okay.
It was just very difficult to make the kinds of decisions you had to make.
Okay.
You were interested in the welfare of that child, and also you knew that some parties were going to be hurt by your decision.
You retired recently.
I did.
What brought you to that decision?
Well, I guess you decide that for everything there's a season. And I decided that I was ready to do it. What I've done is to go back and sit with the Supreme Court, so I haven't really retired very much. They haven't had a fifth member for the last year because of the conflict between the governor and the nominating commission over the selection of the fifth one. So I've gone back 4 times and sat with them. The Court of Appeals is shorthanded right now, so I'm going to sit with them in August. And I've taken a couple of trial court cases, so sort of keeping my hand in.
Okay. How are you enjoying your retirement?
I'm enjoying it.
What are you and Pandy doing now that you have more time to?
Well, we're traveling a little more. We're going to Russia in September. I've been going through rehab. I had my knees replaced, so that's taken some part of it. And I'm trying to get back to playing tennis, starting again. I've been playing golf. So.
Okay. How are you liking your retirement?
I like it. I do.
Okay.
I like the mix of some work, and I don't think I would ever want to not work entirely. Because I always loved the law, I thought it was challenging, interesting, something different every day. And I want to continue to keep a hand in that if I can.
Are there any areas or topics that I haven't discussed that you'd like to bring up?
I don't think of any. I think you've been pretty thorough.
All right. About to wind up. One final question. How would you like to be remembered now that you retired from the court?
Well, I guess other people are going to select how you're going to be remembered, but I'd like to be remembered as somebody who was fair and honest and worked hard at the job. And one of the things that was a pet peeve of mine was delay in the courts, and something I worked very hard at as Chief Justice. And so I'd like to be remembered as somebody who got their opinions out on a timely basis. Always thought that justice delayed was justice denied, and that you needed to do that.
Well, Justice Anderson, I can tell you you've succeeded in all those areas. You've been a great lawyer, a great justice, and have done a lot to advance the system of justice in our state, and we're very appreciative.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. I appreciate you taking the time, and Barry, the Bar Foundation, taking the time to do this interview.
Thank you very much.